All right, so let's get started with this. And in this webinar, we're going to be looking at how to test your APIs. And just to be clear, this isn't how to use Rapyd's APIs or anything like that. This is focused more broadly on API testing in general. So this is looking at the idea of wanting to be able to do some tests on your APIs and getting started with that in some way. So before we get into it too much, let me start with just introducing myself. I'm Dave Westerveld. I've been a professional tester since 2008, so I've been doing this for a while. I've got a lot of experience in a lot of different areas. I've done exploratory testing, manual testing. I've done a lot of different work in that, but I've also done a lot of work around UI and API testing. And currently I'm working on a lot of stuff to do with strategy around automation frameworks and helping out with that kind of stuff. I also love to learn and I love to write. I've got a blog that I write at offbeattesting.com, and I am the author of a book on API testing and development with Postman. So I like doing all these things because I like to learn by teaching other people about testing. So I've got some courses and blogging and all that kind of stuff, and I do that as a way to continue to keep myself sharp and to share some of what I've been able to learn over the last few years. With other people as well. And you can see down at the bottom of this slide, I kind of give myself a bunch of different labels, right? I'm a tester, I'm an author, I'm a teacher, but I'm also a learner. And I think that's an important thing in any context, and certainly when it comes to testing. We need to be ongoing learners, always learning about new things to do. So when it comes to API testing, what does the company want? Well, I think what companies want out of their software is the best built, longest lasting, highest quality, cheapest product, right? They want high quality, but nobody wants to spend a lot of money on it. And understandably so, businesses are in the business of making money. And so they want to be able to get good quality stuff without needing to fork out high-end prices for it. So what do you do? How do you get that? How do you get good quality at an affordable price? And the solution is automate everything, right? I've yet to meet a manager that doesn't believe that test automation is one important way to deal with this problem of getting good quality at an affordable price. And actually, I think they're right. I would totally agree with that. One of the best ways to improve quality, given the time constraints and money constraints that a business has, is actually to use software to create leverage. I mean, that's kind of what the whole point of software is, right? Is creating leverage with software so that we can more efficiently do the things that we would otherwise need to do. So I agree, this is the solution. But the problem is there's this annoying thing called reality. And reality makes it hard to achieve these solutions. We're not always so great at delivering on the promise of making these things efficient and effective when it comes to automation. Testers in particular, I think, have tended to focus on UI automation. And over the years, we found these kind of tests, they can suffer a lot of challenges around flakiness and performance and some other things. But you know, with a lot of modern web applications and even not so modern ones, they come with an API, right? Some products are even just API first or API driven or primarily just an API. The API itself is the product. But even ones that aren't, there tends to be usually some form of API that you can use to drive the product, perhaps even just an internal API that you can use. And so testers have looked at this and realized, hey, APIs, that's a little more stable than trying to find locators in your user interface somewhere. And so a lot of testers and managers are realizing, hey, there's some potential here to do some good testing. So we just need to go forth and create API tests, right? And then everything's going to be good and wonderful and great joy and rejoicing. But maybe not. Because I think there's a whole new set of skills to learn here. How do you actually go about doing this effectively? We could just jump in and start creating tests, but that's not necessarily going to work out the best. Also, there's so many API testing tools. How do I pick which one to use? And how do I structure the tests? And what kind of things should I be checking? What kind of things should I be looking for? What kind of things should I care about? And so you get this big hairy ball of things that's all tangled up that you got to try and figure out. And then you get a customer complaining, hey, there's a bug here. You get a product manager come and say, hey, can you look at this? Your manager asks you to look into something, and next thing you know, that API testing isn't happening. So what do you do? Well, I think this kind of testing is really valuable. So in this presentation, I want to move you from this place of stress to a place of maybe even getting excited about API testing and what it can do for you and what you can do with it. So let's look a little bit at what we're going to learn throughout the rest of this presentation. I'm going to break it up into a couple of categories here. The first one is API testing is testing. So sometimes we can get caught up in the API side of API testing, and we think it's all about learning APIs and how to manipulate APIs and how to use APIs, but we can't forget the testing side of it too. API testing is still testing. However, it is different, right? API testing isn't the same thing as manual testing. It's not the same thing as user interface testing. It is different, and so there's some different things that we need to pay attention to when it comes to API testing. And so we'll look at some of those things. What are some of the things that are specific to APIs as it relates to testing? And then we'll also look at a few quick ideas on API test automation. Now, obviously, API test automation in itself could be an entire webinar or more. So we're just going to skim over a couple of really brief points. And actually, we're going to do that for all of these things. All of these topics are huge topics in their own right. But in the next 20 minutes, half hour, we're just going to skim through some of these things to get an idea of what's going on. So API testing is testing. And I want to start with exploration and not tools. So I think one of the problems that we can face in the industry just in general, and certainly when it comes to API testing, is getting all caught up in tools. We start doing like a requirements analysis, and what's all the different things that I need, and what's all the different things that this tool can do. And there's so many different tools out there. And next thing you know, you've got a huge spreadsheet full of requirements and tools and what you want and what you have and what your dreams are. And somehow you still haven't gotten started with actually doing some API testing. So rather than getting caught up in that, I want to say start with exploration. Just go, start using the API, see what you can come up with. Don't build out an entire requirements matrix, but start to explore it and see and understand what it is. So what this comes down to is that how the API works matters more than what tool you're going to use to test it. So the particular tool out there, I mean, at the end of the day, yeah, it's going to make a difference. In the long run, you're going to need to be able to select a tool. But what's more important is understanding how it works, because once you get an idea of how this API works and what it does, you'll be in a much better place to actually figure out which tool is going to make sense for you. So if you're planning, it's important to start with figuring out what it does. And so that's why I say start with exploring. Look at the API, see where you can go with it and what you can learn from it. But then an objection that you might get to this is, wait a minute. We should start with planning when it comes to testing, right? We don't want to just jump in and start doing testing without doing a bit of planning first. And there's some truth to that, but I think in order to make good plans, we have to know what it is that you want to do. And you can only kind of figure out what it is that you actually want to do, what it is that actually matters, once you have a bit of an understanding of the problem that's in front of you and what it's possible to do. And so once again, I would say start with exploration. Get in there, call some endpoints, figure out a little bit what the structure of this API is, what the data looks like, get a feel for it, this kind of intuitive sense of what's going on. And I will say, don't start with tools, but I'm going to make a quick tool recommendation here, just in terms of getting started. If you already have a tool you use for hitting API endpoints, great, go ahead, use that. But if you don't and you're kind of new to this, getting started with it, I'd recommend just download Postman. It's an easy tool to get started with, kind of makes a fair bit of intuitive sense. You can just plug in your endpoint and your request method and just go pretty quickly. So for a tool that's just helping you get started with exploration, I would definitely recommend that you just download Postman and start there. All right, so exploration and testing. I mean, this kind of begs the question, right? What is it? Great. we should start with exploration, but that's not very helpful if we don't know what exploration actually is. And so I've put it here, looking with the intent of learning something valuable. And to maybe make that a little more concrete, you can see in the background of this image a picture of something from Age of Empires, which is a game that I used to play, a few years back. And one of the things you have to do in this game is you have to explore around on the map to find the resources that you need. And as you do that, the more you explore around, the more of the map lights up. So you can see right now there's just a little light patch and a lot of darkness around. But as you explore, you reveal more and more of the map and get a better understanding of what resources are there, what enemies might be there, what problems might I be facing, what resources do I have to face those challenges. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for exploratory testing. When you start out, you don't really know what's going on. I don't know. But as you start to call different endpoints, as you navigate through the API and explore different things, you start to get a bit of a feeling, oh, okay, this dark cloud of uncertainty that I started with is starting to clear up. I'm getting a better idea of what I'm up against, what's available, what's possible to do, what things are difficult to do, what challenges there are that I don't understand yet, and you start to get a bit of a picture and idea of it. And I think you can even extend the analogy a little bit further as well. So in the game, when you're exploring the dark areas of the map, you didn't usually just go and wander around randomly and just do things for no reason. You're trying to win the game, right? So you had a purpose in that I'm trying to see if there's particular resources, see if there's particular problems. I might go in a particular direction to help me because of a strategy that I'm executing in the game. And so you had a purpose behind what you were doing. And it's the same with testing. You need to have some kind of purpose that's guiding what you're doing. So you're not just going in and exploring and just trying things totally randomly. Maybe the first couple of things you do until you get a little bit of light on the situation. But once you understand a little bit what's going on, you're going to want to have some kind of purpose that's driving your exploration so that you're being effective with it. So how do you get that? What are the ways in which you can find that purpose? And I would say asking questions is a good way to do it. So on this slide, I just put examples. These are some examples of questions that you could use to guide your testing. But obviously, these questions are going to vary depending on your context. If you're very familiar with an API already, maybe you've worked on developing it or you've been using it for a while, you're probably going to ask a different set of questions. So these set of questions are kind of assuming that you're not very familiar with it. But the idea behind this isn't the particular questions that you're asking, but the fact that you're kind of asking some questions to guide yourself and give yourself a bit of a mission as you go through this testing. So like these questions here, what does the API do? That could be a good question to get you started, right? Okay, what does this do? When I call these things, what kind of responses does it give back? What kind of data do I get out of it? And then you could extend that even further to what business problems does it solve? Why does this API exist at all? Why did somebody go through the effort of making this API? Probably to solve some kind of problem for somebody in some business. So what business problem does it solve? What are the most important parts of this API? So what are the things that probably a lot of people depend on? What are some of the things that maybe not very many people use? Can you get a feeling for that and understanding based on who the clients are and the way the API is structured? You can usually get a bit of a feeling as you explore through what are some of the important parts of the API. And then a really important question, what kind of risks might this API be hiding? What are some patterns you see, design patterns going on, or data patterns going on, or just oddities that you see in certain areas that stick out as differing from those patterns? All those things can highlight or indicate there might be some risks here that are hidden that we need to dig into a little more and understand better. So those are just a couple examples of questions that you can use to help guide your exploration and push you towards exploring in useful ways. So the next thing on the category of API testing is testing. So this is a general testing principle here. Search for business problems, not just payload problems. So I think what we can tend towards in testing is looking at just the functional aspects of what's right there in front of us. So I call, get information from this URL, and I look at the payload. I'm like, all right, nicely structured, got good JSON, gives back these look like valid data points. Everything looks good. And we can kind of stop at that point sometimes. Be like, okay, like this data looks fine. I think we're good. And we stop asking the question of, is this data actually solving the problem that it's supposed to solve? So this kind of comes down to the saying, doing the right thing versus doing the thing right. So we can get caught up sometimes just on verifying, is this API doing the thing right? Is it, properly serializing and deserializing the JSON data? Is it doing the things like these basic things correctly? And that's good questions to ask. But that's not actually even the most important questions to ask. The most important questions is, does this API do the right thing? Like, is this actually what we need this API to do or not? So maybe let's just walk through an example of this to understand it a little better. Here's just a totally made up example of an endpoint that's, a quiz. Somebody takes a quiz in a online course, and the endpoint, we got these two different endpoints here. So you can get your score based on your score ID, right? So I've got the score ID, give me back the score for this particular user, with this quiz, and there's their score, 75, right? Or you could go over to the quiz and say, hey, for this quiz, give me the information on it, and you get, here's the list of quiz questions that you go look at and see what those questions are. And then here's some properties on this quiz. And one of those properties is, hidden score equals true. So you try a few different combos. You try the score and the score ID one, and it looks good. It always gives you back a valid user ID. It always gives you back a valid quiz ID. It always gives you back a score within, the range of 0 to 100. And so you're like, okay, yeah, this endpoint's good. It's working, right? I checked the payload. The payload's giving me back the right data. It's working correctly. And the same thing with the quiz one. You check it and you get back different data, and yeah, it's good. It's always giving me back the payload that I'm expecting. So everything's good here. Is this okay? Like, is everything actually good here? I mean, maybe, but maybe not. It kind of depends on what the needs are out of this API. So imagine that the client needs to be able to display the score, but they only can display the score if the hidden score property on the quiz is false. So in that case, they're going to need to query the quiz endpoint and the score endpoint and combine those two things together to figure out whether or not they should actually show the score. And I mean, maybe that's okay. Maybe we could combine the data somehow. Maybe we could structure it differently, or maybe it's fine as it is. But the thing is, we should be asking that kind of question. Is this actually solving problems effectively for people? And maybe even at a deeper level, if the hidden score is set to true so that the score should be hidden, does that mean we shouldn't return the score at all in the score API? Because maybe the user could go and look in that API returned result and see it even if it's not being displayed in the UI. So when you start to ask questions like this, you can get into a little bit more of like, what are the business needs for this? What is this API actually trying to achieve? And is it doing that well? And so those are the questions where you really can get to high value problems that you can find that sit outside of just verifying a particular payload. The next testing principle I have here is think about weird stuff, not just the happy path stuff. So I think we have a tendency to emphasize skew towards happy path. We look at, okay, yeah, I did this and this and this, then it did what I expected it to, so therefore this is cool. But there's a software law called Hiram's Law. And Hiram's Law basically says something along the lines of it doesn't matter what your contract specifies. If you have enough users, all observable behaviors in your system will be depended on by somebody. So there's just, if you get enough people using your system, somebody's going to use it in some weird way that you don't anticipate or think about. And another thing to think about here is, like, there's just the people who do things that you don't maybe understand why they do it. But there's also the people who maybe people that you don't like. And what I mean by that is a hacker or somebody who's deliberately trying to use the system in a wrong way. But even it doesn't even have to be someone who's trying to hurt you, but it's someone who's trying to use the system to create some kind of cheat or things like that. So as an example, imagine someone who is on, eBay or some site like that, and a bidding auction site, and they go and they're bidding against somebody, and they see, oh, okay, this person is bidding against me and I don't want them to. So they call the API using the other user's username, deliberately giving it wrong credentials. They're not trying to hack their account. What they're trying to do is lock their account out. So they keep spamming it, hoping that the API will lock that user out and make it so that that user can't keep bidding against them. So that's an example of just thinking, okay, like that's weird. Why would somebody deliberately spam the API if they're not trying to hack it? And you realize, okay, there can be a situation where somebody somehow is going to be using this in this weird way. So thinking about that not all the users of your system are going to be super ethical. Not all the users of your system are going to do things the way that you maybe think they will. So trying to get outside of that happy path and thinking about some of the weird stuff that people can do is a great way to approach testing. And then also we just have to be careful not to get caught up in functional requirements only. There's a lot of non-functional requirements that are necessary for good quality. Performance is super important. If you think about the way in which people use a site, if it takes too long to load, they're gone. And it doesn't matter how good your functionality is. It doesn't matter what kind of great functional requirements you've met. And it doesn't matter how well coded and what good quality everything is. If it's not performant, it's really not going to add value for people and they're going to leave. And security is another one. It's one of those things that's just kind of table stakes. People assume that when they come to your site, their information is going to get stolen and it's not going to get hacked. And if it is and does, that ends up causing a lot of big problems. I think if you look at the most expensive bugs in history, most of them have been some form of a security bug that has cost companies a lot of money due to the fallout that comes from that. So these things are important things to think about, even if they're not necessarily functional requirements that are built right into the specifications. And then there's the ilities, I've called them here, so usability, reliability, testability, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of different ilities that make up these properties in the background of a system that contribute quite a bit to the quality. And so we should be thinking about and considering these things in testing as well. How usable is this API? What's the discoverability of it? How hard was it for me when I was doing that exploratory testing to get in there and to figure out what this API does and how it works? How comparable are the different endpoints to each other? How consistent is this API? All those things play into the usability of your system, and that's a contributor to the quality of it. The reliability, how much does it stay up? The testability, how easy is it for me to actually check the things that I need to check? So all these things add up to contributing heavily to quality. And so we should be thinking not just about, does this API do the correct thing in the correct way, but also, does this API work well from a holistic viewpoint of quality with these non-functional requirements too. So we've looked at how API testing is, well, it's testing, and there's some testing principles that we've considered, but API testing is, the API is in there. So there are some things that are a bit different about it compared to other kinds of testing. It is still a unique type of testing. So let's dig into a little bit about what some of the differences are and some of the things that you want to pay attention to about API testing itself. So one of the things that is interesting about API testing is figuring out the endpoints. Now, perhaps you've got good documentation. I think Rapyd does a pretty good job in looking through their documentation. There's a nice set of endpoints listed there. You can go through it. You can probably find all the endpoints that you need or care about. But when you're testing, sometimes there's different hidden endpoints. There's endpoints that might belong to particular kinds of users. And so you may have to do a little bit of spelunking to figure out what those endpoints are and where they all are. So the finding this stuff can be a bit of a challenge. Depending on how well documented and I'll assure you that not every API is as well documented as Rapyd's API is. And so what I'm talking about there and figuring out the endpoints, this first part here, the coverage, right? Like how many endpoints are there? What are all the endpoints that we have available? How do I construct the URLs for all these different endpoints? That's kind of figuring out what's the coverage of this API in terms of how you can call it and what the tree map of it would look like. But then there's another aspect of figuring out the endpoints that is also a little bit different perhaps than some other forms of testing, and that's what I'm calling here the anatomy of an endpoint. So the anatomy is figuring out like how a web request is put together. So the method, the get, the put, the post, those things, the URL that you're actually hitting, the headers that you give it, the body that you give it, the kind of this anatomy of a web request is something else. You don't need to know every detail about it. You don't need to be able to, understand TCP protocols and like all the details of what goes into a web request. But it's helpful to have a basic understanding of what's happening when you send an API call over HTTP. So it's one of those things that it's worth knowing a bit more about when it comes to API testing. So if we go back to that first one, the coverage of an API, that API map, how do we find this information? How do we figure out what endpoints are available? And I mean, I already mentioned docs. That's a great place to start. Depending on how complete the documentation is, that can be one of the primary sources. But not every API is documented. You may find, especially more so with internal APIs, APIs that aren't client-facing, they may not have as much documentation. So you can then turn to some other sources of information. So I put humans here, for example, and humans are your teammates, your manager, product managers who own the product, developers, all these people that you interact with who may have some information about the API that can be sources of information to figure out what stuff you might be missing in the API. Another great place to look for finding endpoints is in the dev tools. If you pull up your dev tools and watch the network calls as they go by on the network tab, and you see all the different network calls go by, you may be able to figure out which endpoints are available in an API and which ones you can call. So that can be another great source of information for figuring out the different endpoints. And then, of course, there's the code base itself, right? So you can look in the code and search through the code. And even if you're not a coder, if you're more focused on the testing side of things and you don't spend as much time understanding and reading and writing code, you'd still be surprised sometimes what a simple search, with looking at an expression based on the structure of the API, what that can get you in terms of information from the code base itself. And the nice thing about going to the code base is it's a great source of truth because it's kind of actually defines what the API does. Sometimes documentation can get out of date. And so the code base can be a good source of information. And then I put the last one here, smart guesses. So you're probably not going to use this very often, but I have sometimes found some interesting things by looking at, there's this pattern going on. API does this, and then it does this, and then it does this. So I wonder if it also does that. And I try it, and it does. Or, that's interesting. It gives me this error. So sometimes you're not going to use this a lot, but sometimes a smart guess can be a way to get some more information about API. And then there's the anatomy of a web request. So we'll just go through this really briefly here. You probably want to dig in a little more on some of this stuff on your own time as well. But at a high level, there's web requests. You have your method, which is, the get, put, post. It's telling the server what action to take based on the request that you give it. And then, so sometimes that's called the verb, right? Verb show action. It tells the action. And then you've got the URL, which is the location that you want the server to manipulate, or the resource that you want the server to do something with. And so that's called the noun sometimes as well, because that, a noun is a thing, and it's the thing you want to do something to. And so when you send that's kind of the two basic pieces of information, but then you send with it headers, and headers are kind of server specific data that says, hey, server, here's a little bit of context to help you understand how to process this correctly. What type of content am I sending you, or something like that. There's many different kinds of headers, but the headers give the server context, and they don't really have a lot to do with what the user is doing so much as just information for the server itself. And then the body is, it's optional depending on the type of request, but the body usually dictates what you want, what data you want the server to use when you're manipulating. So if you post some data to the server and you give it the body, you may say, hey, create an object that has this information, and the information goes into the body of the request. And then you got parameters. So parameters are ways to, extend your URL, add filters, add different things like that, and add queries. So they're really helpful and really important things to understand as well when it comes to web requests. And then cookies also are another thing that adds some complexity around this. So they help you kind of track web requests across multiple requests. So a cookie will, it's data that lives on your computer on the browser side that helps to share information across multiple requests, because otherwise you'd have to keep sending it back and forth. So again, just something to dig into and to understand a little bit when you're looking at web requests and the API part of API testing. So what about testing third-party APIs? This is an interesting one as well, because when we have an internal API that we're testing, an API that a team owns, our team owns, or another team in our company owns, we can have pretty good control over it. We can figure out what to do. We can probably know when things are changing and update based on that. But when it comes to third-party APIs, we don't really have very much control over what they're doing with their API. And I think we should also change our testing strategy when it comes to this. So a couple of things that I've listed here. One is be respectful. And what I mean by that is you're using someone else's API, so don't try to break it. Your goal in testing third-party APIs isn't to make sure that it has no bugs. That's the goal. That's the job of the people who create that API. They're the ones who ought to be trying to figure out if it has, flush out the bugs in it and fix them. Your job isn't so much to figure out, I need to find every bug in this. It's to make sure, does this API do what I need it to do for the purposes that I have? So limit your testing to the things that you're interested in when it comes to that. And don't run performance tests against it and stuff like that. Just be respectful of the fact that this API does kind of belong to somebody else. And then I call this test your contracts. So that's the idea of look at the things that you care about. So set up, okay, I need this API to give me this data in this circumstance. That's the information I care about. And so set up a test that checks that. Create a contract that says, hey, when you send me this information, when I send you this information, I need you to send me this, and test those things. So kind of keep your testing specifically targeted to the space that you're interested in. And this is where you have a little bit less of that, go explore the entire API and find out all the information, and a little more targeted at, all right, I just want to verify this particular set of functionality that I'm looking at. And then another thing with API testing is figuring out auth. So when you're testing a website, user interface, Usually the auth is pretty simple. You get an account, you log in, type in your username and password, and you're done. But with API testing, it's similar. And a lot of times your auth is being done by an API in the background when you log into a website. But it's worth thinking a little bit about. So there's two different aspects of auth here as well. So on one side, I've called it using the auth, and that's where you may want to be testing other things on the site, right? You're testing a particular endpoint, and you don't actually care about the auth itself, but you have to specify the authorization in order to be able to call that endpoint. And so that's where you have to figure out how to do the auth just so that you can do the thing that you want to do. And then on the flip side of it, there's more, okay, I'm actually testing the authorization itself, the authentication itself. I'm going through and making sure that like these workflows work, that I get the correct information, that it doesn't allow me to log in when I'm not that kind of user, that I end up with the correct permissions after I log in as certain types of accounts, and so on and so forth. That's when you're actually testing auth itself. And that's like its own entire huge thing that I'm not going to get into here. But the reality is when you're doing API testing, unless it's a public API that's totally public and has no auth at all, most of the time you're going to need to be able to figure out how to authorize your endpoints so that you can do the other testing that you want. So when it comes to that, there are types of auth, there's more than this, but I'll just quickly go through this, and this is going to be like extremely high level, just touch on it. Your best source of information for these things is to go look at the documentation for the API you're using, see how they set up auth, talk to the devs, talk to people who know how this works, because there's a lot of variation from API to API in the exact details of how these things work. But at a high level, when it comes to auth, you can have basic auth on an API, and that's kind of the equivalent of setting a username and password in the API in a user interface, and sending those credentials to the server. The server verifies it and gives you back or doesn't give you back a response based on what you sent. So that's basic auth. It's not really used very much. It's honestly not super secure. So what probably most APIs do now is use bearer tokens, and that's where you send some kind of token along with your request, usually in the header of the request. That token is encoded to specify the kinds of things you're allowed to do, the kind of user you are, and who you are, and all those kind of things. And the server can verify that in the background, and it can get pretty complex how those things happen. But in terms of usage, once you've got your token, it's usually fairly easy. You just send the token with your API request, and everything gets verified. And you can do the work that you need to. And OAuth is a way. So OAuth is kind of a way of using a third party or someone else or another server to generate these tokens for you. Again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of how these things work, but just at a high level, so you're aware of some of these terms. These are the kinds of things that you can do for auth when it comes to testing APIs, and this is the kind of stuff you'll really need to dig into and to understand a little bit if you want to be able to use an API. So that's the API part of API testing. Really quick skim over. Now let's do a really quick skim over API test automation. So I think APIs are one of the most powerful places to automate, and that's I think because of the fact that APIs are actually designed to be interacted with programmatically, right? That's kind of the idea of an API, is that, a user interface or a third-party developer or some other program can call the API to get the data that they want. And so they're meant to be interacted with programmatically. But most APIs, at least the kind that I've been talking about here, which are, broadly, they're called RESTful APIs or JSON-based APIs, give back user-readable data. So they're nice that way, that they're easy to interact with programmatically, but they're also fairly easy to see and understand as a human. So they bridge that gap quite nicely between the machine and the human side of things. which lends itself actually to making it pretty easy to do test automation. And also another benefit here too is that you're kind of testing a lot more code with each call, right? So there's pluses and minuses to that. It obviously gets a little slower compared to say a unit test or something, but you can also get a lot more coverage, which can give you some more confidence that your code is doing what it needs to do. So all those things wrapped up together, I think APIs are a great place to focus in on when it comes to test automation. But of course, you still need to have some careful thought there. It can still get out of hand. You can still end up checking things that don't really matter. If you try to do all of your testing at the API level, you're going to find that it's problematic as well. You still need to have some structure and thought and planning put into place for your API test automation. But as I said, automate it. They're more stable than UI tests for sure. API tests tend to be much more stable. You don't have UI selectors that might change. Perhaps your API version changes or some data changes in the API over time. But generally those things are much easier to adapt to and to work with. So API tests are almost always more stable than UI tests, and they've got a lot more coverage in unit tests and integration tests, and really almost as much coverage as a UI test as well. So it's a pretty good trade-off between the two. So definitely spend some time automating API tests. It generally has a pretty good payoff. But how do you do it? How do you structure API test automation well? I mean, there's a few different paradigms and choices and approaches you can take here. You could kind of structure it around endpoints, right? So here's a list of all the endpoints, and here's a API call to each of those endpoints, maybe with a few different parameters that the endpoint takes, and a few different user types that authenticate with, and so on. But kind of structuring it around the endpoints themselves. But you can also structure around workflows. You can kind of say, okay, a client comes in, and this is the workflow they go through. They log in, they do this action, they do this thing, they check this result over here, they generate this report, and here's kind of like a sequence of things that users are generally going to do, and they'll call the API in this way. So you could structure your API tests around workflows as well. And then the third way is structured around contracts. So this is where you may have a specification file like OpenAPI or something, and you can use that to kind of drive your testing, create contracts that say, when this thing happens, when this data is sent, this data is returned. And I expect that to always be true. And you can kind of define some of these contracts to automate the generation of your tests themselves. So that can be very helpful if you have some of those things in place. But once again, don't forget about the fact that there's more to testing than just verifying the contracts and the payloads. In terms of which one of these to use, I don't think it's either or. I don't think it's only one or the other. If you have contracts available, it's great. Structure your tests around those contracts. If you don't, I would say, structure around endpoints, but don't exclude workflows either. You can do a bit of both, right? So you can have a bunch of endpoints and hit on all the different endpoints, but then also create a few, sets of tests that are looking at a particular workflow and making sure that clients are able to work through the entire system. So create a combination of some of these things. But one of the biggest things is just to make sure that it's structured in a way that's understandable for other people to use. And of course, the assumption behind all of this too is that we're creating regression tests. So this is once you've done that exploration, once you've kind of figured out what the API does, and now you're like, okay, we need to make sure that it doesn't change in dramatic ways from this, because this is the kind of stuff that we need to keep doing. And if it does, we need to be aware of those changes. So we're talking here about kind of setting up regression tests and not so much about setting up test exploration. And so that brings me to the end of the presentation. And at this point, there is time for questions from the audience. So thank you all for listening.